Hi everyone, this is Legacy School Year 7 History, our lesson 27, the Peasants' Revolt. Today we will discuss the consequences of the Black Death. We will understand what made peasants unhappy and why they revolted. We will talk about the events and the consequences of the revolt. Alright, so if you remember, we spoke about the Black Death during the previous lesson. We mentioned the symptoms, we mentioned where it was coming from and how it reached Europe. The direct consequences were, of course, the millions of lives lost Europe-wise, and of course in England as well. In Europe, 25 million, approximately 25 million. Of course, we do not have exact numbers, but 25 million people are estimated to have died in the Black Death, or in this outbreak of the Black Death. And in England, 1/3 up to half of the population, so up to 2 million people probably have perished. This created a situation where landowners did not have enough help on their farms. Because a lot of people were actually peasants. They worked on the farms. 90% of the population worked on farms or was involved on the farms somehow. So landowners did not have workforce. Peasants wanted more money because they were fewer. They could ask for more money, and they started moving from farm to farm, asking for higher wages. This led to some peasants having more money than others. They had surplus of money, and it allowed them to buy those houses and those lands that were left behind by those that died in the Black Death. And as we mentioned it in the class, entire villages, small towns became empty because the Black Death just basically killed everyone. Now these peasants who started to earn more money, and they started buying those lands and houses, those empty houses of the victims, they created a new class of peasants, a richer peasant class called the yeomen, right? So this is starting to create a class conflict, because obviously the noblemen, the knights, the barons, and of course the king, they don't want the feudal system to be challenged this way. They do not want another class, and certainly they don't want a rich peasant class, or the rich class of peasants. This was against the rules of the medieval feudal hierarchy. Now, if you remember, we have already learned about the feudal system. You can see this pyramid. You've seen this before. So on top of the pyramid is the king, who gives land to the nobles, and in return he gets money and knights, of course, from the nobles. The nobles give it to the knights, and the knights give service and protection to the nobles, and the knights themselves get land from the people above them and they give it to the peasants underneath, right? So the feudal system is based on land. All the land belongs to the king, and the king distributes it to people for services, for protection, and so on. But the peasants do not have land. They only work on somebody else's land. Now, King Edward III was the king at that time, created a new law after the Black Death created this class conflict and the environment in which the peasants wanted more money for their work. He created a new law called the Statute of Laborers, which fixed the peasants' wages, their salaries, okay, at the level where they were before the Black Death. So that was a very, very low, or they were very low wages. Of course, this met with discontent. There was another law passed called the Sumptuary Laws, or a set of laws in 1363, which was again very unpopular with the peasants and the lower classes of the society, because these sumptuary laws they told basically which class could wear what kind of color and what kind of material. So the most expensive materials like silk, for example, or fur coats could be worn by the richer people, velvet and so on, and peasants could only wear very, very cheap material. So even the king and the nobles wanted to show, even through the clothes and the way people were dressed, to which class the person belongs to. It's quite discriminatory if you think about it. Of course, the tensions were rising, and peasants were unhappy about all these discriminatory rules and regulations. Now, in 1377, at the age of 10, Richard II becomes king. Of course, he was too young to rule the country, so the country was basically governed by his uncle John of Gaunt. Of course, he had to listen to his advisors. One of them was John of Gaunt, and the other one was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon of Sudbury. His uncle kept convincing him to continue the war in France, as England was losing more and more territories. And Simon of Sudbury, his chancellor, and the Archbishop of Canterbury advised Richard II to introduce a new tax called the poll tax. Poll means head. So it's basically an amount of money that was supposed to be paid by everyone, rich or poor, over the age of 14 years old. Now that was another very unpopular law, and the peasants quickly revolted against this. Now, in 1381, when this poll tax was established, they started collecting the taxes, and of course the officials from London went all over the country to collect this tax. Now in Essex, it happened in Essex, that the peasants refused to pay these taxes, and they killed the tax collecting clerks. Now, of course, very quickly, this created an organized revolt, and a yeoman called Wat Tyler, please remember his name, Wat Tyler organized a few thousand peasants, and they marched to the king. And unfortunately, on the way to the king's palace, they killed and murdered whoever they thought was against the peasants. They murdered Simon of Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury as well. And when it comes to John of Gaunt, the uncle of Richard II, they burned his palace to the ground. Well, when the peasants reached London, they asked for a meeting, and Richard II agreed to the meeting with the leaders of the peasants. You can see in this picture, this is a picture of Wat Tyler meeting the king, and eventually what happened to him. Let's just talk about that after a while. Now, what were the demands of the peasants? Now, they wanted to be free of the control of the lords, okay, to have no laws limiting their wages. They wanted to pay lower taxes, and they wanted that the king should listen to them, that the king listens to them, okay? Now, the outcome of this meeting was first quite favorable for the peasants. Richard met Wat Tyler in this meeting that he agreed to, but unfortunately, after an argument, somehow Wat Tyler was killed by the mayor of London. Now, Richard II saved the situation and did not become violent. He agreed to the rebels' demands. He promised them everything was going to be fine. He was going to punish his advisors, and he just asked the peasants to go home, which they did, right? Unfortunately, just like if you remember John I, about the signing of the Magna Carta, Richard II also reconsidered his decision, and he went back on his concessions. Not just that, he tracked down and killed 200 of the leaders of the peasants after they went home. One of them was John Ball, before the peasant revolt, he was already very famous. He was a priest, but he became very famous for speaking against the social order and the church. He told people that God did not create people to be rich and poor. And this is a big mistake made by the church, that they force people, some people to be poor, and they themselves are very rich. So of course he was very unpopular with the church, and he was imprisoned several times, and eventually he was excommunicated as well, which means that people were not allowed to listen to him preaching at all. Okay. Now at the time of the revolt, he was in a prison. As we mentioned, 1381, when the revolt started. At that point, he was in a prison, but he was freed by rebels, and then he quickly joined the revolt as well. Of course, after the peasants went home with after the agreement with Richard II, they went home. John Ball was imprisoned again at St. Albans, and he was executed by Richard II, hanged, drawn, and quartered, as it was usually done with traitors, as Richard II thought he was a traitor. Now, of course, the peasants' revolt might look like a big failure from the peasants' point of view. But it did have some positive impact on the life of the peasants. The feudal hierarchy, this pyramid that I showed you earlier, was finally challenged. Okay, this was the first time it was challenged. And another very positive thing coming out from this revolt was that the poll tax was cancelled, and it was not collected by the government. After this, wages gradually rose, and nobody could stop it because there was just no workforce. Okay? The population did not grow that fast. Farmers were still needed, so noblemen could not do anything. Wages naturally rose. By 1500, all peasants were free, which means that the Magna Carta applied to everyone in England, not just the nobles. If you remember, we mentioned earlier that at that time the Magna Carta was pretty much supporting the demands of the free men and the richer classes, or the people living in cities. But now, after everybody became free, not depending on a lord or a landowner, the Magna Carta applied to everyone. This last picture that I would like to show you is depicts the meeting between Richard II and Wat Tyler. All right, so please take a look at pages 68, 69, read them, and answer questions on page 69. Thank you.